everyone, welcome to the April 25th edition of the TimeformUS Pacecast. I'm David Aragona. My usual co-host Craig is still on vacation this week. He missed last week's podcast and this one as well, but Craig is going to be back for the second half of this week to go over some of the weekend racing with me, and of course next week to do our Kentucky Derby coverage. But in Craig's absence, we're going to skip the usual recap of last week's racing that we would do. Craig was diligent enough to send me the speed figures. That's not the issue, so I did get the top figures from last week, and I'll just mention that we saw some nice performances from horses like Proxy in the Oaklawn Handicap. That was a really thrilling finish with Proxy running down both Last Samurai and Stiletto Boy. And I think the biggest TimeformUS speed figure from last week was earned by Defunded in the California, kind of that unexpected last to first victory by him. And of course, there was some nice racing at Keeneland. But rather than go in depth about all of those performances, with the Kentucky Derby around the corner, I wanted to do some Derby focused content. So I reached out to a guest who I'm thrilled agreed to come on the podcast to chat with me about the Derby. He's someone that many of us will be watching on our TV screens when the Derby rolls around next week. So let's welcome in this week's guest. He is national political correspondent for NBC News and MSNBC, also covering a variety of sporting events on NBC these days, including serving as horse racing analyst for NBC's Kentucky Derby coverage the past couple of years. Steve Kornacki, it is an honor to have you on this podcast.
David, right back at you. It's an honor to be on your podcast. I think I told you an email, but I mean it. I have bet Aqueduct so many times, looked up 5 minutes before the race, seen your pick, and realized I was on the wrong horse. So.
That is awesome. And I'm going to get a little bit more into your horse racing fandom in just a little bit. But at different times in my life, I've been a bit of an MSNBC junkie. I watch, especially around like the major news events and elections. And I've been such a fan of your work in that political space, going back to, I guess, the mid-2010s when you first started doing work with MSNBC. And for the longest time, I had no idea that you were somebody who also had a major interest in horse racing. So just tell me a little bit about your first exposure to the sport and what drew you to racing as a young person.
Yeah, like so many, I think, a family member, in my case, it was, an uncle still around, who was really into it. Took me, I can still remember it. I'll date myself a little bit here, but it was the summer of 1986. It took me to Scarborough Downs, Southern Maine. This is before their era really of simulcasting. So you had the thoroughbreds, the harness course there, and you just bet what was on the track. And I think I was about 6 years old. I had 5 straight winners. My uncle wouldn't bet a single one of them, and I've never had a night that good in the 35 years since.
That's pretty awesome. You always have to have that person in your life that introduces you to the sport, because it can be such a difficult learning curve for somebody coming to it fresh. And, obviously there's something about racing that captured your interest as a young person for you to still, be a fan of it today. So what is it about horse racing that sort of keeps you coming back?
There's so much of it. There's excitement on so many different levels to me. There's the sort of like puzzle aspect of it. Looking at every race, any given race, whether it's a big one or a small one, and just trying to kind of figure out, who's a real contender in here, who isn't, and where's the, where, if at all, is there some value in here? Where is there a chance to make some money? I do think the betting aspect of it, drew me in right away too. Just the opportunity to, especially if you can identify a long shot and, turn $2 into $20, something like that. You start to learn the jockeys, the trainers, the different circuits, the traditions, the big races. There's a complexity, I think, to the sport, because it's just so sort of diffuse. There's no sort of, it's not this national, it's not like the NBA or the NHL or the NFL, where it's very, cohesively organized at a national level. It's just so spread out. And it kind of exists in so many different ways, in so many different places, with so many local traditions. And I've learned a bunch of those and experienced a bunch of those over the years. And I just find that, even now, I'm still learning it, still experiencing new aspects of it. And I don't necessarily get that from other sports, I think.
Now, from watching some of your content, especially your more recent work covering the Kentucky Derby and other major races for MSNBC, or NBC, I should say, I get the sense that you're not somebody who's afraid to go for a price or try to pick a long shot. I seem to recall that you were the only one on the broadcast that picked Medina Spirit to win the Kentucky Derby back in 2021. I think that first year that you were covering the Kentucky Derby. So are you somebody that's kind of seeking out those prices? What kind of handicapper and bettor would you say you are?
I'm not a great one. I'll start with that. Also, they'll never get that Medina Spirit money back from me. I know ultimately what happened there, but I'll still claim that one as a win. Yeah, I mean, if anything, to be honest, I'm almost scared. It's almost the opposite. I'm definitely not scared to take a price. I'm often scared to take too short of a price, often to my own detriment. I instinctively look to get beyond the favorite, and I think I'd be a smarter and I'd be a better if I was more willing sometimes to accept that the favorite's going to win the race and then to try to build value vertically. I've tried to be more mindful of that, as I've gone along. But as I think part of the excitement to me, honestly, is that there's an emotional aspect of it. Really, part of the excitement of horse racing is finding an underdog, is finding a long shot. And when you can find one and when it actually wins, there's just a real rush right there. And you mentioned, Medina Spirit, to have that happen, at least at least in the moment in the Kentucky Derby, it truly was a thrill.
No, I mean, he was a cool horse that I know a lot of us were fans of, and obviously that story played out the way it did. But as you said, you definitely were right about him on the day, and you got paid that day. And the horses, I mean, you do become fans of them over time, especially the ones that you get to see over and over again in these big races. And, you brought up the sentimentality of it a little bit. You can become fans of these horses, and when you're transitioning to craft your bets or decide who's the right value, you kind of have to weigh your heart against the objective brain to see who's the best value bet versus who you're kind of rooting for with your heart.
And that's the dangerous part of the sport to me too. And I've just reached a point where I try to be. I've tried to learn more and more and be more intelligent in how I bet and more kind of cold blooded and ruthless about it. But ultimately, I reached a point where I'm okay with. There will be races when I have a horse like you're describing. I'm sentimentally attached to it. I like the horse, and I look at it and I say, these are not the odds I should be looking for on a horse like this. I should be throwing this horse out, or I don't think this is the right setup for this horse. But I'm going to do it anyway because ultimately I am going to go with my heart over my head. This hit just to me just last Saturday. This pardon me. This happened. I really like Last Samurai, who was running in the Oaklawn Handicap, was trying to sweep those older male races they have there every winter and spring. And, I think 5-2, 2-1 was the price. I thought it should be a little bit, given the field, I thought it should probably be a little bit bigger than that. And he lost by a nose, but that was one of those where I had a feeling as I was doing it that it wasn't going to work out, but I couldn't stop myself from doing it.
No, that was one of those situations where maybe he was the right bet. I mean, he got so close to winning the race. The other horse that took all the money in there, Charge It, maybe was the one that had the negative value on him. And sometimes you can have that right take on a bad favorite and still not necessarily land on the right horse. So, I mean, it's just a really difficult game to be right about all those different factors. When you're handicapping a race, obviously you're somebody in your political work that's used to weighing a lot of different factors. Are there certain handicapping factors that you put a lot of emphasis on, like, let's say, the speed figures or class or watching trips or anything like that? I mean, is there an angle that you try to come at the race from?
Yeah, it'll depend on what kind of race I'm looking at. If we get into the Kentucky Derby or something, I've really kind of conditioned myself in the points era. And this is how I landed on Medina Spirit a couple of years ago. But I've conditioned myself to look for horses that I think are going to be, on the lead or very close to the lead. I just think there's a premium on that in the last decade in the Kentucky Derby. When you're talking more, just sort of the random sixth race, at Parks or something. I'm always class drop, for instance. I'm always looking to see if there's a class drop. I perk up right away. Jockey trainer combos. I'm interested in a lot of different trainer stats. I'm kind of interested. I know you can use that formulator on DRF, and you can plug in all sorts of different sort of combinations, all sorts of different variables. Sometimes the sample sizes, you can reduce it to such a small sample size, you'll get a very misleading percentage. But I'll get excited if I can create a combination that, that gets you to like a 30 or 40% hit rate or something.
Yeah, for sure. A good stat for Brad Cox tends to mean a lot more than a good stat for a trainer with just 5 horses in the barn. So yeah, you could definitely play around with that formulator tool quite a bit. So I'm curious, how did the opportunity to cover the Derby come about? Because obviously not everybody who works in the political space would have the chops to transition to, sporting events, but also especially something like horse racing. How did that transition work for you?
Yeah, I feel real lucky. It came about after the 2020 election. The first thing I did for NBC Sports was, probably a couple weeks after the 2020 election, they asked me to do the NFL playoff scenarios on Sunday Night Football, because it was last 4 or 5 weeks of the season. And I really thought there was a pretty strong natural connection there between what I'd been doing on the election side with what they were looking for me to do, because so much of the election coverage, in the weeks and months leading up to it is you're playing out different scenarios. Listen, if Trump wins Pennsylvania but loses Wisconsin, what does that mean? What does the path look like for Biden at that point? What does the path look like for Trump at that point? What are the probabilities? That sort of thing. You're looking at road to 270 scenarios and probabilities. That's essentially what I was doing in the run up to that election. And then obviously throughout that election week, as the states kind of slowly were colored red or blue. And there was a natural connection, I think, to the playoff chase. Same thing, hey, look, if the Packers win this week and the Vikings lose, what does that mean? How does that change the odds? How does that change the probabilities? So that's how we kind of approached it. And, obviously it was a thrill for me to get a chance to do it. I was, one of those sort of like pinch yourself moments. But they were happy enough with it. And they asked me if I was interested in any other sports coverage. I said, well, I know, you've got the Triple Crown, and that one I'm real interested in. And I wasn't sure if they'd go for it or not, but they, they've been so great to me, and they gave me a shot to go down to Churchill in 2021. That was the first one. This will be the third one. Did the Preakness as well. Unfortunately, we're losing the Belmont this year, and I've got to do the Breeders' Cup as well. So those have just been, really just we kind of call them bucket list moments for me. Just to be there by itself is kind of a thrill. To be there and be part of the broadcast is for me super cool.
Yeah, as a fan of yours over the years, I think one of the things that I was really drawn to in your coverage of elections is just the way that you're able to break things down for us to understand and really highlight the competitive aspects of each of these political races. And, obviously I know what handicapping a race looks like and, basically coming up with the storylines for a race like the Kentucky Derby. But when you're working the political space, you come on the air and you have to talk about, some district in some state that maybe you've never been to. And, you could get a question from like a Rachel Maddow who asked about a specific district or a county that maybe you weren't prepared to talk about. Do you kind of like do a lot of prep work, especially before election season? And I would imagine that takes hours of note taking and research. Or is it just stuff that you carry around in your head? Because it seems like you're able to come up with a lot of stuff on the fly.
Yeah, it's both. It's the accumulation of years of prep. I think, before any given election, I'm studying right now, prepping right now for 2024. Really for right now, my focus is more on the primaries, the Republican primaries. It's an open question if there's even going to be competitive Republican primaries. There's a scenario there where this, I think, ends up being a coronation for Donald Trump, and in a lot of these states we won't really pay that close of attention to in the primary season. But right now I have to operate under the assumption that we will. And so I'm looking at, past Republican primaries in these states, demographic patterns in the states, where different, types of voters, different groups, are where they tend to cluster, what the trends have been long-term in these states, all sorts of stuff like that. And just starting to get ready under the assumption that, we've got to be ready for those states in the winter and spring of 24. And whether we do or we don't, there's a certain amount of that I'll retain. A lot of it I'll just forget. But I do add a little bit more every election to what I kind of retain, and I leave every election. I find myself getting more and more nervous I actually to make a horse racing comparison, I remember hearing Tom Durkin, obviously the longtime NBC announcer, say that by the end of his career, before those biggest races, the nerves were just getting too much for him. And I think in a way I can relate, because I feel more and more nervous, more and more apprehensive with each new election that I do. And it's because what the prep teaches me valuable things, but it also teaches me how much I don't know. And I have an awareness. I have more and more of an awareness of where there are gaps in what I know, where I don't know things, and it creates kind of a fear that, oh, geez, is this going to come up? Is this going to be? Am I ready for this? Am I ready for that? And I just find myself in the days and the weeks leading up to it more and more, kind of in fear of, am I ready? Am I ready? Am I ready?
Well, I can say as a viewer, it doesn't really come across that way on screen. I mean, you really do seem to have a command of the subject matter that you're talking about. And, given that the elections happen in early November, I kind of wonder, I mean, can you even appreciate the Breeders' Cup when it rolls around? Because, I mean, it kind of falls right on top of each other every other year or so.
Oh, I've got some fun stories with that. Yeah. I mean, so 2020, the Breeders' Cup was the weekend after the election, except the election lasted the whole week. So, in my head, I went into election night 2020. There was a scenario where, hey, if Biden had won Florida in 2020, which he almost did, that could have been a very quick election and basically called within a day or two. And in that, scenario, my mind was already on, oh, great, I can go watch the Breeders' Cup this weekend. Well, the week plays out. Obviously, Florida goes to Trump. A bunch of other states do. We're in this cliffhanger. And now I'm thinking to myself, geez, it's on my mind. Like, yeah, so much for watching the Breeders' Cup this year. We called the election at 11:37 a.m. on Saturday. I had been here all week, 2 nights straight through. And I called my boss at 11:37 and I just said, look, we've got the winner. We've crossed the finish line. You want to come to me one more time to kind of do a big wrap up? Happy to, but then I'm heading out of here. And he was like, fine, that's it. So I was out of there in about 25 minutes, got home, got changed, and got out just in time to catch the Breeders' Cup Sprint. I remember that was the first one. I went with a couple of friends, and the first race that we got there for to watch was the Sprint. And I put a bet on Whitmore, and Whitmore won it at 18-1. And I said, that was one of my best Breeders' Cup hits ever. And it came after that incredibly long week. And it was not based on great research or great study. When you talk about the sentimental connection, I liked Whitmore. I liked the old horse. And he came through at big odds. So that was a memorable Saturday for a couple of reasons for me.
Yeah, nothing like a score like that to take your mind off some of the stresses in your life. So definitely, I can imagine that was a big relief and a nice outlet. Before we transition to talking about some of the Kentucky Derby stuff, I just kind of want to state, hearing that somebody like you is into racing, I mean, having followed you for so long, it just kind of makes so much sense to me. I mean, knowing the kind of analyst you are and the way that you approach things, and it gives me a little bit of hope that if somebody like Steve Kornacki can have a love for horse racing, I mean, maybe that there's a different kind of person that the racing industry should be marketing to, because like you were saying, I mean, it takes these problem-solving skills, and it's a great outlet for somebody that wants to solve that puzzle, and unlike something like an election, you find it if you're right or wrong in 2 minutes or less. So, I feel like it's a puzzle that if more people got exposure to, they could gain more of an interest in it.
I agree, and I've kind of tried to. I've wondered with this explosion in sports betting and everything, all the apps now where you can just do it on your phone. I guess there's a debate here whether this is going to be good or bad for horse racing. Just in that it obviously it makes horse racing so much more accessible to anybody. You could turn on FanDuel, you could turn on whoever's NBC, you could turn on whoever's covering the races on any given day, and you can get right into it on your phone. You can make the bet, you can make the deposit, you can listen to all the analysts on TV, and you come up with your own opinion, and you can bet it, and you can watch it, and you can do that all day and all night. But I guess the flip side of it is it's now true for every sport now that it's so easily accessible on your phone. And I watch so many people, who are now, it's not just that betting on the NBA or betting on the NFL is now legal. Now what I see so much of is the in-game betting. So there is, it's not like they just place a bet and then sit around for 3.5 hours watching the NFL game. They're betting player props in game. They're betting the over under in game. They're betting, the spread in game. And so I still think, even though it's the sort of the apps and the iPhone and all that creates an opportunity there for horse racing, that you're still in that competition with those other sports. And I don't know, I know there's a lot of conversation right now about, one thing I know is that the pari-mutuel odds, I think, are an obstacle. When I talk to sports bettors my age or whatever, who aren't really into horse racing, they get very confused by the concept of pari-mutuel wagering. And obviously, I know it's a big story right now. These sort of computer syndicates that put this last second money in, and you watch 25-1 become 5-1 in the middle of the race. I've seen novices look at that and just be, baffled and irritated by it. So I think there might be something that racing needs to do in terms of, fixed odds, or I guess doing what NYRA does, which is shutting it off a couple minutes ahead of time. But I think that might be one obstacle that racing could do something about.
100%. I mean, there's an opportunity there, but there's also an impetus to innovate a little bit and try some new things, and we'll see if we can eventually get there. Always running a little bit behind in the horse racing world. Well, let's transition to talk about some Kentucky Derby. And I kind of want to start with this question. You already previewed this a little bit. I know you were talking about the pace situation and looking at some past history of Kentucky Derbies and how that's all played out. Do you approach the Derby different than you would another race? I know some people take into account a lot of factors when they're handicapping the Kentucky Derby that they might not, looking at the third race at Aqueduct on a Thursday. Do you kind of view it that way as well?
I do, because there's 20 horses. And I think, in addition to, I think that there's just a change that it's almost impossible to miss when you just look at the last 10 years from when the point system was instituted in 2013. There's just been a change that has really favored the forwardly placed horses. Obviously, we're in the wake of Rich Strike winning last year from 19 lengths off, so there are exceptions. But you've seen so many forwardly placed horses do well in the point system. So I think I account for that, and I account for the 20 horses and just the potential for, if you're not forwardly placed, the potential to get caught in traffic that you've never experienced before and you'll never experience again. And so it makes me, I think, downgrade horses that I know are going to have to come from off the pace. And it makes me, if I'm going to play them, it makes me want better value in terms of odds on them. So it's, for example, right now, when you look at a horse like Tapit Trice, I'm very curious about Tapit Trice. I could absolutely see Tapit Trice winning the race, but Tapit Trice has broken a little bit slowly, and in a 20 horse race, it might be a lot harder to overcome that, I think. And just a lot more easy to just get caught in traffic and have that kind of dreaded trip. So that's the kind of thing I start taking into account, and then I start looking for, well, who am I more confident is gonna, break cleanly and at least be near the front. Once there's, they get around that first turn into the backstretch, who's going to be near the front and, at least in contention. And again, like when you mentioned Medina Spirit at the front, that was ultimately what I saw the potential for Medina Spirit to be near the front. And I knew Medina Spirit in the lead at that point, I think, had never been passed before. And I saw double digit odds. And those were the three things that just, I want to take a long shot. Or I want to take some kind of a price. And I want to be near the front. So that's what led me there.
Yeah, I think it's definitely wise to be aware of some of those trends, and you bring up the point system, and there definitely was a little bit of a change in the way these races played when the point system was implemented. Arguably last year, as you said, a bit of an outlier, but we'll see if the trend returns this year. And with 20 horses signed on, I think there's often this expectation that the pace is going to get more competitive than it sometimes does, and maybe it's the point system, or maybe it's just the 3-year-olds and the way the results worked out this year, but this seems like yet another Derby where there aren't that many confirmed frontrunners runners signed on. So I think what you're saying holds true a little bit. And that applies to a couple of the top pledger trainees. And, you say you're somebody who's always looking to find some chinks in the armor of the favorite. So, I do want to ask you about Forte, who kind of is the consensus favorite. A lot of people believe he's going to be a clearly defined favorite in this Derby. Do you see vulnerabilities with him?
Yeah. It's because now look, obviously post position in the trip had something to do with it, but that Florida Derby win, he had to eke that one out. And Forte is an interesting one to me because I compare him to the horse he edged out in the Florida Derby, Mage, who's going to be a long price. I think is going to be a pretty long price, in this. And they've run together twice now. And I think between those two races, Mage took a pretty big step forward between the Fountain of Youth and the Florida Derby, made that really impressive move in the Florida Derby to get the lead. I think, Cyclone Mischief had been in the lead. Mage, made the move, was eye to eye with Cyclone Mischief and then was pulling ahead. And that's when Forte came and passed Mage at the very end. And I just sort of look at that race and I'm saying, well, geez, if you like Forte coming out of that race, and it's not just that race, I mean, the overall body of work, but if you like Forte and you're ready to take, I don't know, 5-2 on Forte, and you could get Mage at a much, much bigger price than that, I almost think, why wouldn't you take Mage with just, 3 career races with potential upside there, with the improvement, we already showed with that turn of foot that you've seen. So I start to get watching Forte run in the Fountain of Youth and the Florida Derby actually ended up making me more curious about Mage.
I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, Forte, we saw what he could do, his optimum performance in the Breeders' Cup Juvenile, and arguably he hasn't really moved forward off that in his 2 performances so far as a 3-year-old, so we'll see if he can take that step forward in the Kentucky Derby. But like you were saying, I mean, Mage ran just as well last time, and he's got that upside in just the 4th start of his career, and that can, of course, be a double-edged sword in a race like the Kentucky Derby. Inexperience often works against horses, but like you were saying, that's going to be built into his price, so I think that there are legitimate reasons to get interested in a horse like him. What do you make of a runner like Derma Sotogake, the Japanese Invader? Now, if you're going off history in the Kentucky Derby, I guess you generally want to avoid these horses that are coming out of the UAE Derby. There just has not been a whole lot of success there. On the other hand, Japanese horses have been having success at other meets around the world there where they didn't before. It's kind of been this new phenomenon where you've seen a lot of Japanese shippers doing well. So there's this assumption that eventually that's going to translate to a meet like Derby weekend. How do you assess a horse like Derma Sotogake?
Yeah, wow. I could see, I don't have a hard time imagining Derma Sotogake winning the Derby, and I don't have a hard time imagining Derma Sotogake being the next Mendelssohn. The great hope coming out of the UAE Derby, and this is going to be the year when that prep actually produces a winner, and then is basically dead last. I don't know exactly what the problem has been with the UAE runners in the Derby. To be 0 for 18, I think 5th place is the best performance. And I look at Derma Sotogake, and so the pluses would be, like you're saying, this does not look like there's going to be a real hot pace, and is probably going to be forwardly placed. So I was saying that's something I look for. I think that's positive. I think that UAE Derby performance, I mean, make of what you will of the UAE Derby as a Kentucky Derby prep race, but that's one of the better times you've seen in the UAE Derby for a winner. And I think the very, very unofficial, buyer speed figure estimate for it was somewhere between 104 and 106. We have Randy Moss at NBC who works on those, and I think he said that's it's unofficial, but that's about where he'd peg it, which would be best in the field. And then I like the jockey. I like the idea of Christophe Lemaire as the jockey who got caught up in that super hot pace last year, and I think maybe learned something from that, and I think may give Derma Sotogake a different kind of ride this year, mindful of what happened last year. And then, like you're saying, the Japanese success on the international stage in the last few years, here's the one big missing piece. and there was a ton of hype last year about Crown Pride, and obviously that all fell apart. Maybe this is the year. I guess the other way to look at it, where I get a little skeptical, is that UAE Derby itself, where it was, gate to wire for Derma Sotogake, inside, right next to the rail. Was there a real advantage there that day to that position? Did that sort of overstate how good the horse was? Kind of a weird race, I think, right? Where it was almost, it was like a merry-go-round, right? Nobody was passing anybody. So maybe we're inflating what that time looks like and what that victory actually represented. But you're right. It feels like the Japanese are just knocking on the door, in one of these years, they're going to do it. And there's a lot of reasons to think this could be it.
Yeah, it's one of those situations where I feel like price is going to be critical with a horse like this, because there are a lot of things to like about him. Like you said, the fast projected speed figure, and I really respect the job that Randy Moss does with determining that kind of stuff. And I know Craig Milkowski, who's my typical podcast host for TimeformUS, he came up with a very similar assessment to Randy. So, two of the sharpest race timers in the industry, I really trust their assessment of a race like that. And when you watch some of his prior Japanese races, he's not some confirmed front runner. He can come from off the pace. So I like that there's that versatility there, maybe like there perhaps wasn't with a horse like Mendelssohn, who garnered so much attention a few years ago. So price feels like it's really important with a horse like this. If he's 12-1, I think he's super interesting. I kind of doubt he's going to be a price like that, because I just noticed him picking up a lot of steam, and maybe some people just not overwhelmed with some of the American runners and just defaulting to a horse like this. So I'll be interested to see how the betting plays out on him relative to some horses that have run some pretty fast speed figures in the United States. Horses like Practical Move, who feels like he might be flying under the radar a little bit. Really done nothing wrong pairing up 100 buyers in his last couple starts. And even a horse like Two Phils, who has a really fast speed figure on the synthetic, but again, kind of want to let price be the guide with a horse like him. Do you put a lot of stock in those horses who are coming in with those fast races in their final preps?
Yeah, so Practical Move is really interests me, and I've been curious why there hasn't been more buzz around Practical Move. I know, just based on the breeding, on the pedigree, you're supposed to doubt that there might be some kind of a distance question there, but that horse has put up consistently impressive speed figures and has done nothing wrong so far. It's a great established track record. California coming into the Kentucky Derby over the last decade or so, not just Baffert horses. A great storyline, right? Like if Timmy Actine, who gets famous for sort of babysitting Baffert's horses last year, suddenly produces his own, and I think there's a great storyline there as well. And I'm wondering what the odds are going to look like on Practical Move, and if they do start to drift up a little bit, I'd be really tempted there. Two Phils, I haven't known what to make of. I have a buy. Well, again, this is one where I've got a bias against the horses coming in from like the Jeff Ruby Stakes because of the surface. But of course, last year you had a horse win the Derby from the Jeff Ruby Stakes who didn't even have a big number in the Jeff Ruby Stakes. I think it was an 84 buyer for Rich Strike in that race last year, right? So now you got a horse who put up a real big number, has shown something on dirt before. Another thing, I guess, maybe to think about is we've had pretty good weather the last few years for these derbies. What if we get a wet track? What if we get rain this year? I haven't seen any long-term forecasts at this point, but is Two Phils the kind of horse too, if it's raining, that I might get a little more interested in? Because I think he's had some success on a wet surface before too. So that might come into it, but yeah, you hit on one there. Practical Move is definitely on my mind. And I've been a little puzzled that he hasn't gotten more attention.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of things to like about that horse, and I kind of agree with what you're saying. You don't want to get too caught up in pedigrees at this stage of the game when the horses have kind of showed all of us who they are at this point, and I'm not sure how much difference pedigree is going to make when these horses are all trying 1.25 miles for the first time, or basically all trying the distance for the first time. So it sounds like you've got some interest in Practical Move, a little bit of interest in maybe Mage at a big price. Is there anybody else I didn't touch upon? I know Brad Cox is going to potentially have 4 runners in this race. I didn't mention any of them. I know Angel of Empire is one that's gained some attention from fans moving towards the Kentucky Derby. But anybody else I didn't touch upon that kind of you might have your eye on heading into Derby week?
Yeah, about half the field, but yeah, I mean, you mentioned like Angel of Empire. I'm curious about it. I don't think that's where I'd be right now, but I could see a lot of reasons to be there. One that I can't get out of my head, and that I think most of the smart people who I listen to on the handicapping side of things are telling me I should get out of my head is Kings Barnes. I understand the Louisiana Derby was run at a glacial pace, and that might be even that might be a generous description of the pace of that race. But so it's not going to be the pace that Kings Barnes gets in the Derby, but maybe he was just taking what they were giving him that day. Is what I kind of can't get out of my head. And again, we're talking about a lightly raced horse here with, I think, a considerable amount of upside. And a horse who previously, before the Louisiana Derby, I don't think had to have the lead. So I think if they do go a little bit faster in the Derby, and they will, they're obviously going to go faster in the Derby. The question is just how much faster are they going to go? I do think Kings Barnes can be forwardly placed. And it's a question. I don't know the answer, but I'm curious if Kings Barnes actually might be one of those horses who can sit off, be up there, sit off, and close with a really strong kick, and be at a price too. That's one I can't get out of my head, even though I know I'm supposed to just sort of wave away the Louisiana Derby.
No, I hear what you're saying. I mean, there's that axiom that you're just supposed to bet against horses that are coming off perfect trip victories. And like you said, that's what Kings Barnes had in his last race. But you have to weigh that sometimes against the perceived upside. And I mean, he's a horse that's won his last two races so easily. And maybe there's more there. I think that's something we don't really know yet. And can he take that step forward in just the fourth start of his career in a 20-horse Kentucky Derby field? These are all variables that make the Kentucky Derby such a fun race to handicap. And I mean, there are going to be some big prices in this race, horses that a lot of people are going to write off. I know that didn't work too well last year. Personally, the line maker in me is going to kind of be interested to see how they bet this race, if there's any reaction to Rich Strike winning last year. I know we saw a big reaction to that in the Preakness last year when horses that looked like they should have been 50-1 were going off at 12-1. I kind of wonder if there's going to be a ceiling on how high the odds go on anybody in this Derby.
We were taking a look at this, and I think 2010 is a good barometer because it was the year after Mind That Bird, and I think the longest price in 2010 was like 31-1, and I think in the Mind That Bird year there was 5 horses who were 50-1 or longer, something like that. It was a dramatic difference year to year. So yeah, I'm looking for the Rich Strike effect in this too.
Yeah, and if that situation does occur, it just creates better value on some of the shorter prices because it's a pari-mutuel game, and if the money's spread around more evenly, then you might get some better value on those horses that are maybe 7-1 instead of 5-1. So it's definitely something to pay attention to in this Kentucky Derby. Well, Steve, I really appreciate you making the time to come on the podcast. Like I said, I've been such a big fan of yours. It was really fun to get to have this conversation with you, and I know that I'll be looking forward to your coverage on NBC next week.
Thanks. No, really appreciate it. It was great talking to you, David.
Yeah, thanks for coming on, Steve, and I'm sure all the listeners appreciated your take on this Kentucky Derby. Thanks again. Well, everybody, thanks for tuning in to this special Derby-focused edition of the TimeformUS Pacecast. Remember that you can always catch these TimeformUS podcasts on DRF.com, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. Wherever you get your podcast, just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Again, everybody, thanks for tuning in this week, and Craig will be back for the TimeformUS forecast coming up later in the week.